Welcome back. Previously, we implemented the backend API endpoints to support a paginated exploration of the blockchain. Now we're going to refactor our main blocks component to utilize these paginated endpoints to do that exploration. First up, we want to keep track of the paginated ID in the component within the state. So that way we can control which page of blocks we want to fetch. Let's initialize this paginated ID as 1. And now in the component mount, we'll fetch the blocks along with this paginated ID rather than fetching the entire blocks array with the regular blocks endpoint. To facilitate this, we're going to define a new helper method in the class called fetch paginated blocks. So overall, it's called fetch paginated blocks. It's going to be set to a callback function. All right. Then we'll want this fetch paginated blocks method to take in a paginated ID argument, which represents which paginated ID we want to make the fetch for. As a result, we'll make a fetch request to the blocks endpoint along with the paginated ID specified. So we can use the overall fetch code, but in addition, within the ternary expression, we're going to have a slash and then mix in the paginated ID that we're getting to the method. And then we can follow up with the identical .then handlers that we have for the existing regular blocks request. So it'll get the JSON response and then set the state of the blocks to that returned JSON. Cool. Finally, instead of making a fetch to the regular API blocks endpoint in the component mount, now we can call this.fetch paginated blocks and then pass in the this.state.paginated ID. All right, let's get rid of that first initial fetch as well. Cool. Now, we're not done yet, but let's check out this application and the changes in the meantime. In the command line, make sure npm run dev is going. And now in the browser, if we go to home and then blocks, we should find that there is a limited list of 5 blocks overall. All right, cool. But this is the most recent block, as shown that the last block is no longer the Genesis block. All right, that's pretty cool. Now, the paginated blocks endpoint is definitely working, but we now need a way for the user to designate different pages to fetch in order to render different blocks. To do this, we're going to create a series of buttons that the user can click in order to make new calls to the paginated blocks endpoint, but with various paginated IDs. Since a paginated endpoint is split up in sections of 5, according to the blockchain length, well, we'll also display a number of buttons according to the blockchain length divided by 5. This means that we'll need the blockchain length in the component state. So add a length, or rather a block's length overall to the state, and this will be 0 by default. We're going to get the length from the backend within a component did mount. So we'll make a fetch. We're going to compose the overall URL by using the document location origin. And the endpoint we want to hit is API/blocks/length. We can follow with the usual .then handlers. One has a callback that calls response.json from the response parameter, and the second one gets the consume JSON and will call this.setState, and it will set the state of the block's length to the returned JSON. Cool. And now we'll want to present a number of buttons according to the block's length divided by 5. To create some buttons, we're going to import the button class from React Bootstrap. So import button from React-Bootstrap. And right below the main block's title, we're going to render this array of buttons. So below blocks, let's have a div section for a new section of buttons. Now, to create this array of buttons programmatically, based on the array length divided by 5, our strategy will be to dynamically create an array of numbers from 1 to that block's length over 5. So for example, say the block's length is 20. Well, then we'd want to generate an array from 1, 2, 3, and 4, because 20 divided by 5 is 4. Now, if it goes over 20 to 21, then we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to account for that last page of the 1 block. Okay, to do this dynamic generation of numbers going in a sequence, we're going to use a combination of a few JavaScript functions. Now, taken together, the line is going to look a bit funky and unique, but piece by piece overall, it's digestible. First up, we can build an array of n undefined values using the native JavaScript array constructor. N in this case is this.state, meaning n, the number n as a variable, is this.state.blocksLength divided by 5. Now the number in here has to be a whole number, but not every block's length is going to be perfectly divisible by 5. So let's get the ceiling of this result with math.ceil. For example, 21 divided by 5 is actually 4.2. But if we call math.ceil, that'll return 5, which gives us an array of 5 undefined values. Now under the hood, a JavaScript array is conveniently implemented as an object, where the keys are the items positioned in the array and the values are the items themselves. Therefore, we can get an array of all of these undefined values, but then get their array numbered keys by using the .keys function. So let's call .keys on the array. Nice. So that should give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in an array. Now we want this overall to be in its own array, so let's spread the result of calling .keys in a statically declared array with brackets, and then we're using the JavaScript spread operator to apply each of those keys as an individual element within the array itself. Cool. Now this code is a bit involved, so real quick, we're going to go ahead and check this out by inspecting the element in the browser. Oh, and one thing that I misspelled is Bootstrap. So what is Bootstrap? That sounds like a promising Halloween themed library. That'd be pretty cool if someone made that. But anyway, back from that tangent, the main point is we want to check out what is returned from our funky looking code that we're doing to generate the array of numbers. First up, we can declare a static array and then spread out. And then we have an array of 20 undefined values. So notice it's undefined, undefined, all the way up to 20 of them. But if we call .keys on this, instead what we get is 0 to 19. All right, cool. So that is exactly what we need. In our code, let's map over this array then. So let's call .map over this array. So after the final bracket, we have a callback function with a key parameter. And now in the JavaScript callback, well, let's make the paginated ID the key plus 1. Recall that passing back the value of 1 actually gives us the most recent 5 blocks. Therefore, our first paginated ID should be 1. But this starts from 0 as we just saw in the console. Therefore, we're going to start with every paginated ID being key plus 1. Overall, then, we're going to return a span element. The reason why we're using span is that we want all these buttons to be side by side. But a div, unlike a span, creates new lines between every single division. Since this is JSX and we're mapping over an array, to generate the JSX, we need to provide a key, which in this case, it's conveniently named key, and every one of these keys should be unique. Then we have a button class within here through a pair of button tags. The value for this is going to be the rendered paginated ID as text. Cool. And then to provide some space between each button, let's hardcode a string as text within a pair of curly braces. So this is a nice way to make a space within JSX. All right, let's indent these. Cool, make sure they're still aligned. Then we have the BS size. Let's make this small so that way the button isn't so big since they're rendering right next to each other. And the theme of our overall application is that all these buttons have the danger red style. Cool. And now for the most important part. On a click of this span actually, we'll want to call the fetch paginated blocks helper method. So on click, we're going to call this.fetch paginated blocks. Make sure I put this within the actual curly braces. And then this needs to pass in the current paginated ID. But there is one error in this current implementation. Notice that in our JSX, we're already calling the fetch paginated blocks code. This is because we're forced to use a pair of parentheses to pass in the paginated ID, which also calls the function itself. This is an anti-pattern in React. You don't want to make inline calls in the JSX, otherwise you can run into infinite loops. For example, when the render function is called, it'll reach this line, and due to our syntax, it'll call this.fetch.paginated blocks right away. And then this is going to update the state. Therefore, when the state updates, render method is going to be called, and again, fetch paginated blocks is going to be called, therefore updating the state, calling render, and then we get in this cycle. So it's not a great situation. Now, what we can do is we can inline the fact that this should be a callback itself, that when clicked will fire the code in the callback. But this kind of style is not the most clean style when it comes to implementing React, but we can achieve the same effect in our original declaration up at the top by making fetch paginated blocks return its own callback. And there we go. This allows us to pass in paginated ID, and this returns a callback function. But this also affects our componented mount. So since this returns a function, we now need to call that return function too in order to fetch the paginated blocks. All right, nice. With all of these changes down, let's check out the new paginated blocks buttons in the running application. So visit the app on the browser. All right, let's go home so it can make the fetch request once more. Looks like it's not completely loaded in the backend yet. All right, on that refresh, indeed it is. I'll go to the blocks endpoint, and cool, there's all these buttons now. So if we go to page 2, we get completely different data. How about 3, and then 4, and then 5, we get the final Genesis block. So go ahead and go ham on all of these buttons. Cool, each click gives us a different page in the blocks. And with that, woohoo, we now have a much more scalable solution in place for exploring blocks in the blockchain history. Nice work. Now, congrats. That about wraps up the initial features for this blockchain and currency full stack application. Give yourself a huge pat on the back for completing this project. It's quite an impressive amount of work. If you made your own custom changes on top of that, feel free to add the project to your portfolio as well. All right, again, nicely done. And let's move on to some closing remarks and resources and some other things you're definitely going to want to check out to close up and finish up this course.